Hi everyone, welcome to your midterm exam review session. The best advice I can give you for studying for the midterm is two things. First, use the lecture outlines to organize your materials. And second, and more importantly, write out the learning objectives for each of the chapters or lectures for yourself. So you make sure you understand each and every one of them. So let's go through those learning objectives, shall we? All right, here we go. Next. All right, so first from the nutrition overview chapter, certainly you should know the major reasons why people choose the foods that they do. Know which one's the top reason for sure. Above all, define the term nutrient. Do you have a working definition for that? And of course, be able to list the 6 major nutrients. You know the macronutrients, which are micronutrients, and then there's water. Of those nutrients, which ones provide energy? Remember, energy equals calories. So which of those 6 nutrients provide calories? List the types of nutrition research study designs and recognize their basic differences. So we talked mostly about observational or epidemiological studies where you observe people. You don't learn cause and effect, but you learn about relationships from those studies, as opposed to intervention studies that can be in cells, in animals, or in humans. And those intervention studies are more reliable or tend to be better able to get at cause and effect. And the gold standard type of study of them all, which is the most reliable information, is the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. So understand, what does randomized mean? What does placebo-controlled mean? What does double-blind mean? And in whom do we conduct these clinical trials? Okay. Next up is the dietary reference intakes, the DRIs. Have a working definition for what that is. Well, it's the set of standards for all of the nutrients, the amount that is recommended that we consume on a regular basis. And there's 5 parts of the DRI. The 4 that I want you to pay attention to for this exam, or at least under nutrition overview, include the recommended dietary allowance, the RDA. Have a working definition of that in your head. What's a one sentence definition of that, as opposed to the estimated average requirement or the EAR. I'm probably not going to ask you anything about adequate intakes for this one, but usually when we don't have enough evidence to set an EAR, which is required to set an RDA, we estimate it using an AI, or an adequate intake level. And then the UL, the tolerable upper intake level, is the amount of a nutrient above which you start to see some negative effect. Okay. So again, be able to recognize or define those acronyms and have a working definition of each in your head. And the 5th dietary reference intake is the estimated energy requirement, or the EER. Unlike these other DRIs that we just talked about, the EER is specific to calories, and we'll talk about how you determine an EER when we talk about weight management in just a bit. So be able to define the AMDR. That stands for acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. That working definition there is, well, what % of calories should come from each of the calorie-containing macronutrients. I don't need you to know the ranges, but recognize the definition of that term. And then there's the 4 parts of a nutrition assessment for individuals, the ABCD of a nutrition assessment. That is, how do you determine someone's nutritional status? You have these 4 parts to this exam. Examination of an individual. A stands for anthropometrics. What's included? What are the measures included in the anthropometrics? B is biochemical tests. What might that involve? C is a clinical exam or a physical exam that's done in a clinical setting by a health professional. We look at different things there: the hair, the skin, the eyes, the gait, many things that you would look at in a physical exam. And then finally, D stands for diet. Diet history. What is the person's usual dietary intake? What are their usual dietary habits? and put those all together to assess their nutritional status. Probably not going to ask you about the major nutrition surveys used to assess the nutritional status of the U.S. population. That is NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. That's just a collection of nutrition assessments and other types of surveys to monitor the health, the nutritional health and status of the population to determine whether or not we need to implement any fortification programs or have other interventions in certain populations or subpopulations, I should say. Then identify the major chronic diseases that are linked to diet. Just keep in mind that 4 of the 10 leading causes of death are diet related, so you should know. Go back to that slide or that chapter or that section of the chapter about what those 4 are. The last 2, identify accurate sources of nutrition information and list the 8 red flags that identify nutrition misinformation. Not going to ask you that on this exam because we covered that in the first discussion forum. All right, so that's it for the nutrition overview. What about chapter 2, planning a healthy diet? So first and foremost, we just looked in the previous chapter at how to assess the nutritional status of an individual. Well, how do we assess the integrity of someone's diet or of any diet? And that involves the 6 principles of the diet planning, or the 6 diet planning principles. And that acronym is different from the nutrition assessment acronym. The acronym for the 6 diet planning principles is ABCDMV. Adequacy, balance, calorie control, nutrient density, moderation, and variety. For these, you should have a working definition in your head for each one of these, or be able to pick out an example of one if one is presented to you. Okay. For the next one, explain the purpose of the dietary guidelines for Americans and the My Pyramid, My Plate, the latest of the diet planning food graphics from the USDA. So in general, know why we have those dietary guidelines in place. It's a major policy document that helps to describe and guide a healthy diet for most of the population living here in the U.S. So the purpose, and I think, have in your head some of the key recommendations that you did work with in part 2 of your diet project. So just kind of have those in mind, be able to pick out, what would be among this list of things or these sentences, which one might be included in the dietary guidelines or might be one of the dietary guidelines, something like that. For My Plate, I would like you to remember what it looks like, be able to draw it. I'm not going to ask you to draw it, but have a mental image of it in your head. How the things are oriented. It's not just a plate divided into 4 even parts. Some parts are bigger than others, and some parts are not even included in the plate. So understand which ones are there and in what proportions. For summarize each of the dietary guidelines, I don't need you to do that. I need you to be able to recognize the key recommendations. So we just talked about describing the components of the My Plate and know what the different colors and sizes and shapes represent. So the colors, variety, the sizes, proportion or balance, and the shapes. So just have that in your head. Have that image in your head. Of course, nutrient density, an important component of the diet planning principles. Remember, that is the amount of a nutrient, a given nutrient, or especially a micronutrient, per calorie in a food. So foods that are considered to be nutrient dense tend to be low in calories, but give you high amounts of individual micronutrients in particular. So think about foods that might be more nutrient dense versus the opposite of nutrient dense foods, which would be empty calorie foods. That is, foods that provide lots of calories but very few nutrients. So sometimes understanding what nutrient density is, it helps to think about what it isn't, and that's an empty calorie food. So we have nutrient density, and then we have energy density. And energy density is different than nutrient density. Energy density is calories on top of the equation, so calories per gram. So calories per amount of a food is the more calories per quantity of a given food, the more energy dense it is. And energy dense foods tend to be higher in fat, and lots of added sugar. So again, have some examples of those types of foods in your head. List the information that's required on a food label and identify the information that's required on a nutrition facts panel. Absolutely, you should, if you haven't already, go look at a current nutrition facts panel, go Google one, find an image of one, and, be able to identify what are the components of that nutrition facts panel, what's there versus what's not there. And I did have a reading for you to look at about what's required on that, to be on that label, and what's not required to be on that label. Certain things that are required to be there are required because most Americans are getting too much of those nutrients, and we need to limit them or moderate our intake of them. So what are those nutrients that we need to moderate our intake of that are listed on the nutrition facts panel, and which of the nutrients that are listed on the nutrition facts panel are there because they remind us that we need more. So that's important too. So the next thing about labeling is define daily value, DV. Remember, that's the nutrient standard that we use to express the quantity of different nutrients on a food label, because it's not enough room to list the DRIs for every individual at every age group and etc. And last but not least for this chapter, recognize, I'm not going to have you give examples, but recognize examples of nutrient claims versus health claims versus structure function claims. So these are other things that you might see on a food label. So if I give you an example of each of those, you should be able to pick out which one is a good example of each of those. Okay. Next up is digestion, absorption, and transport. So first and foremost, our anatomy lesson, the parts of the GI tract or the gastrointestinal or digestive tract in order from mouth to colon. So mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. And the large intestine, also called the colon. So in addition to that long, flexible muscular tube of those parts of the GI tract, remember there are organs that are not part of the tract but are secreting different chemicals and other things. They play an important role in digestion. And those include the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So what is the function of each of those in the digestive process? And when you're thinking about, how would you describe the digestion of a food, it helps to think about, well, what's the mechanical digestion of food look like? And remember, digestion is the progressive breaking down of food into smaller and smaller particles and to their individual nutrients, and only then, once they're small enough, can they get absorbed. So during digestion, we have two different actions of digestion: the mechanical digestion, the crushing, the chewing, the muscular actions. Which parts of the GI tract are involved in these muscular actions that move food forward in the GI tract? And then the chemical digestion, which parts of the GI tract does the chemical digestion of food take place? For example, we're mostly talking about the enzymes, where the enzymes produced that break down the different nutrients in the foods that we consume, and where's the gastric acid or the juice formed, and where's the bicarbonate produced in order to neutralize the acid contents, so they can then interact with the enzymes in the later part of the GI tract. And then don't forget about the gut bacteria. They do play a role in chemical digestion. They play many roles, but what is their major role in digestion, in maintaining health? They're certainly an important part of our digestive tract. So list the secretions that break down carbohydrates, fats, and proteins during digestion. So there's different things that break down carbohydrates, different things that break down fats, and different things that break down proteins. So carbohydrates, enzymes in the mouth, start to break down only some of the starches, not other types of carbohydrates. Remember, does the enzyme in the mouth work in the stomach, and why or why not? What's produced in the stomach? during digestion that may prevent that enzyme from working. For the fats during digestion, remember very little fat gets digested in our mouth or in our stomach, but that starts with the action of bile. Again, that is produced where and stored where in your GI tract, and then it's released when you have fat into your small intestine. It helps emulsify or disperse the fat particle in the water, the watery parts of your GI tract, so the enzymes that are part of the watery part of your digestive juices can break down that fat. And then, of course, breaking down proteins. Little to no digestion of proteins in the mouth. You do get digestion, start to get digestion of protein in the stomach, and then it continues in the small intestine. So once we have our carbohydrates completely digested down into monosaccharides, our fats digested down into fatty acids and glycerol, and our proteins digested down into individual amino acids, then and only then can they get transported or absorbed into our body. And there's three major ways in which those nutrients will get absorbed across the cells lining our small intestine. So what are those three ways? Remember, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion or facilitated transport, and active transport or active diffusion. So what's different about those three ways? So once we have things absorbed into our cells, they need to get transported from our cells, either through our bloodstream or through our lymphatic system, and eventually end up in our liver, where they're sometimes repackaged and then redistributed throughout our bloodstream, so these nutrients can get to the individual organs and tissues and cells of our body where they are used for many different things. So the role of the circulatory system, so the blood system, which nutrients get absorbed directly into the bloodstream versus which ones have to go through the lymphatic system before they can meet up with the bloodstream. Then the three major hormones that control digestion and absorption, these are the chemical messengers that are produced one place and act another place. That's the definition of a hormone. Basically, I want you to keep in mind the three that are helpful in controlling the digestive process. First up is gastrin. That's the hormone that helps control or regulate the pH or the acidity level of the stomach. There's secretin, which helps stimulate the release of the bicarbonate or the baking soda from your pancreas when the acidic contents of the stomach get released from the stomach into the small intestine. The pancreas also releases enzymes, so that's the role of secretin. And then finally, CCK or cholecystokinin. That is the hormone that signals sends a signal to your gallbladder to release the bile that's stored there. Remember, bile is produced in your liver, stored in your gallbladder, released into your small intestine, stimulated by the presence of fat, which in turn stimulates the release of the cholecystokinin hormone, which controls that whole process. And then last but not least, describe the common digestive tract problems in humans. I think we should just focus on the major ones, like vomiting. So if you have a working definition of vomiting, not a pleasant thing, but vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, I think that would be helpful. So no basic definition. What are the recommendations when you have one of those conditions? Okay. Next up is first are our macronutrients, carbohydrates. We know there are chemical differences between simple and complex carbohydrates, so you should be able to define where we find them in our diet. So where do we find most of the simple carbohydrates in our diet versus the complex carbohydrates? And know that the simple ones include the mono and the disaccharides, and the complex ones include the polysaccharides, so multiple single sugar units. And the polysaccharides, there's three major types, two of which we find in our diet, which include starch and fiber. and those are found in plant foods. And the third type of polysaccharide or complex carbohydrate is glycogen. We don't find it in our diet, but we make it in our body. It's the storage form of carbohydrate in our body, in humans and animals, just like starch is the storage form of glucose or carbohydrate in plants. So speaking of polysaccharides and complex carbohydrates, again, fiber is one of those. And there are two basic types of dietary fiber that I want you to remember, the soluble and the insoluble. They have slightly different effects in the body, and you find both of those in most fiber-containing foods, but some foods are higher in one versus the other type of fiber. So which foods are higher in soluble fiber, for example, versus insoluble fibers? And the health effects of fiber, lots of good health effects. They help remove cholesterol from our body by helping to promote excretion of the cholesterol that is secreted in your bile during digestion in your small intestine. And the soluble fiber, sources of soluble fiber, will help remove that cholesterol from your bile and into your feces and prevent it from getting recirculated into your bloodstream. So that's how cholesterol leaves your body. So it can help reduce your risk for heart disease. Other functions or health benefits of fiber, it slows down the absorption of glucose. So you don't get spikes in blood glucose. You don't get spikes in the release of insulin. So it helps prevent insulin resistance and perhaps the development of type 2 diabetes. Other things that fiber does, helps fill you up, especially if you drink some water with it, and keeps you fuller for a longer period of time, which increases satiety and satiation after a meal. And that's going to help hopefully reduce your overeating and perhaps lead to lower body weight, or at least not preventing gain of body weight. And last but not least, digestive tract health. Fiber helps reduce the risk of constipation and certain cancers in your body by helping to move some of these carcinogenic or harmful substances through your body more quickly, so they have less time to interact with the cells lining your GI tract. So describe how, because fiber is not digestible, we don't really talk about the digestion of fiber. It goes through your GI tract undigested, ends up in your large intestine, where it is basically food for your gut bacteria. So what are the digestible carbohydrates? They include the sugars and the starches, the simple sugars, the disaccharides mostly, and starches, which are complex polysaccharide. So how are those broken down in the digestive tract? You've got an enzyme in your mouth. You've got enzymes in your produced by your pancreas and released into your small intestines to help break down. There's both the sugars, the disaccharides, and the starches into monosaccharides, and then they're absorbed across the cells lining your small intestine. So explain how the digestion of fiber differs from other carbohydrates. Well, your body doesn't have any enzymes that recognize the bonds between the monosaccharides in the fiber molecule, the fiber polysaccharide. So define lactose intolerance. Speaking of digestive issues, lactose is one of the disaccharides. So know which ones are disaccharides and which ones are monosaccharides. There's 3 of each. Lactose is one of them. In lactose intolerance, what happens to a person? And what is the major reason why they may have lactose intolerance? Hint, it's something missing during the digestive process. So major functions of carbohydrates, in particular glucose in the body. It's a source of energy, just like the other 2 macronutrients. But unlike the other 2 macronutrients, the 2 other functions of glucose in the body are that the cells of your body prefer glucose as their primary source of fuel. So your body has a steady concentration of glucose circulating in your blood. So one of the major functions is of glucose is to prevent your body from breaking down protein. It spares your body's proteins from being broken down as a source of glucose. So if you get enough glucose or carbohydrates in your diet, your body won't be resorting to breaking down your protein tissues to convert them into glucose as a source of glucose to help maintain your blood glucose levels. And the other function of glucose besides energy, protein sparing, is to prevent ketosis. So if you have enough carbohydrate in your body or enough glucose circulating in your body, you will be able to completely metabolize your fatty acids. And if you don't have enough glucose in your body, your fatty acids will only get so far in that metabolic pathway. They'll get to acetyl-CoA and then they'll combine because they can't go further into that metabolic process. They can't go through the TCA cycle. So they build up and they form ketone bodies as an alternate way for your body to, or as an alternate source of protein, an alternate source of energy for the cells of your body, some of the cells in your body, in the absence of glucose. Not a good state to be in for a long period of time. So speaking of blood glucose, describe how the hormones insulin and glucagon, so insulin and glucagon, maintain blood glucose at a constant level. So that's how we maintain that steady concentration of glucose in your bloodstream. So when your blood glucose gets low, glucagon, both insulin and glucagon are hormones. They're both produced in the pancreas, and one is triggered when your blood glucose is low. The other is triggered when your blood glucose is high, like after a meal versus a few hours after eating a meal. So know which one does which. So explain the terms glycemic response, glycemic index. Look for the definition of that. So it's how high and how fast a particular food will raise your blood glucose after eating it and how quickly your blood glucose will return to normal. So have some, ideas in your head of what foods might be high in the glycemic index versus low. Major sources of added sugars in the diet, that's, you should be able to recognize where the added sugars in the diet are. And describe the health consequences of a diet high in added sugars. One thing you need to keep in mind is that a diet high in sugar does not necessarily or directly cause type 2 diabetes, but a diet high in sugar does increase the release of insulin from your pancreas, and doing that repeatedly over time may make your cells less sensitive to the effects of insulin, and therefore may cause or may lead to a high blood sugar condition, this insulin resistance, which eventually may lead to type 2 diabetes. But the first major consequence of a diet high in added sugars is that it's high in calories too, and that's going to lead to overweight and obesity, and that alone can increase your risk for developing type 2 diabetes. And the third major health consequence of a diet high in added sugars is that it causes cavities, dental caries. And last but not least, if you're having a diet that's high in foods that are high in added sugars or simple sugars, it's displacing other foods. So you may develop nutrient deficiencies because the calories that you're consuming are empty calorie foods. So keep that in mind. So the opposite is discuss the health benefits of a diet rich in starch and fibers. Starches are slowed down. Higher starch foods tend to slow down the absorption of glucose, but they're best when they're combined with fiber. So if you're consuming high starch foods, especially vegetables, fruits and vegetables, and grains that are high in starches, make sure they're in their whole form, because in their whole form they have fiber as well. And remember, fibers help reduce the absorption of glucose, so they can help modify the effects or modulate the effects of the glucose from being digested from the starch. And we talked about the health benefits of fiber just a minute ago. Excuse me. So the second of the three macronutrients, lipids, three major types of lipids found in food in the body. Remember, it's triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. So be able to describe the general structure of a triglyceride. You should have that in your head. It's one glycerol, 3-carbon glycerol backbone, plus 3 really long fatty acid chains. Of fatty acids, we know that we can categorize them in different ways, whether they're saturated versus unsaturated. What are the basic properties of saturated versus unsaturated? What do they look like in our foods at room temperature? And of the unsaturated, what's the difference between monounsaturated and polyunsaturated? And what are some of the food sources of monounsaturated fatty acids? Where do you find them in the diet versus polyunsaturated fatty acids? And also, where do you find more of the saturated fatty acids in your diet? And then there's trans fatty acids, which start out as polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're chemically altered to help prolong the shelf life of certain foods. We don't find them very often these days, but where might they show up in the food supply or in food sources? Of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, 2 of them are essential, only 2 of them, linoleic and linolenic acid. Remember, one is an omega-3 fatty acid, the other is an omega-6 fatty acid. And so you should know the major food sources of omega-3s versus omega-6. So for digestion, I want you to be able to, again, describe how and where the dietary lipids or fats are digested and absorbed. So where does fat digestion begin? And what's different about the absorption of fatty acids compared to, or fats compared to carbohydrates and proteins? And one of the differences is that they need to get transported after digestion and absorption. They need fats and lipids, triglycerides and cholesterol in your diet, need to get incorporated into these lipoproteins, which are fat-carrying particles, to get transported throughout your body. So the 3 major types of lipoproteins include chylomicrons, LDL, which stands for low-density lipoprotein, and HDL, which stands for high-density lipoprotein. Each one of them is composed of the same thing, the same 4 components. They have an outer shell of phospholipids, and in that outer shell is embedded certain proteins that kind of like the GPS for that transport particle to tell it where it goes. And on the inside, each of these lipoproteins is transporting triglycerides and cholesterol. So the proportion of those 4 components of a lipoprotein will vary between these 3 different types of lipoproteins. So chylomicrons are the biggest of all. They're carrying a ton of triglycerides that just got from our meal, that just got digested and absorbed. They're carrying it through the lymphatic system because they're too big to go into the bloodstream, and they're carrying it through the lymphatic system until it meets up with the subclavian vein in your armpit, and that's where the bloodstream and the lymphatic system meet. So then those chylomicrons can go through your bloodstream and deposit them in your liver. Remember, after digestion, everything eventually ends up in your liver. So once they are in your liver, once those triglycerides and any cholesterol you just ate, or from your bile, are in your liver, then they have to get repackaged into different lipoprotein particles. So they start out as VLDL, which are very low density lipoproteins, which as they transport fats from the liver to the cells of your body, they're giving off a lot of triglycerides. So as they get smaller, they become LDL particles. So the LDL particles have a higher proportion of cholesterol compared to the triglycerides. And high amounts of LDL cholesterol are associated with higher risk of heart disease because you're depositing more cholesterol in the arteries and that are throughout your body. HDL particles, the high density lipoproteins, do the opposite that LDL particles do. The HDL particles gobble up any cholesterol from dead and dying cells circulating around your bloodstream and bring it back to the liver. And the liver incorporates that cholesterol into bile. And with a high fiber or soluble fiber diet, you can help body get rid of that cholesterol through your digestive tract. All right? So that's transport. fats. Major functions of fat in the body, lots of major functions. We've got energy because they're a source of calories. You've got insulation. You've got immediate energy, stored energy. They're a component of every single one of the cells of your body, the phospholipids. Lots of different functions of fat. So I would encourage you to review those. So discuss the role of fat in the development of heart disease, cancer, and obesity. We just talked about the presence of LDL. High amounts of LDL and cholesterol circulating in your bloodstream does increase your risk for heart disease. Having excess body fat, excess fat in the diet, remember it's energy dense. So if we overeat lipids so if we eat more of our foods that are sources of lipids, we will tend to eat a higher amount of calories in general. So that can lead to overweight and obesity, and being overweight or being obese also predisposes you or increases your risk for becoming obese, having heart disease, and or certain cancers, among other things, and type 2 diabetes, for example. So next, explain the effects of the different fatty acids on blood cholesterol levels, that is HDL and LDL, and the health implications of raising and lower these levels. We already talked about the relationship between these lipoproteins, and heart disease. But which fatty acids increase your LDL, your less healthy cholesterol? Those are the sources of the foods that are high in saturated fatty acids. What kind of foods would those be? And which foods help lower or increase your HDL, and that includes fiber and the monounsaturated fatty acids. So what would that kind of diet look like? Well, it would kind of look like the Mediterranean diet. So what are the components of the Mediterranean diet? We know that the Mediterranean diet has as much total fat as the typical American diet, or the standard American diet, that SAD diet, but the type of fat that's consumed in the Mediterranean diet is much, much different than the type of fat in the American diet. And that's why it's considered heart healthy. So what are some of the foods that you would find in the Mediterranean diet compared to the standard American diet, the sources of fat in each of those respective diets? All right, so that's lipids. Let's talk about proteins, the last and third of the macronutrients. Proteins do differ from carbohydrates and fats insofar as their chemical structure and their chemical components. That is, in carbohydrates and fats, you have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In proteins, you have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen as well, but you also have nitrogen. So that's what makes them different chemically, their chemical composition. Excuse me. But those atoms are arranged differently in each of those respective macronutrients. So explain why some but not all amino acids are essential, and state the consequences should an essential amino acid be lacking from the diet. What is an essential nutrient? You should have a working definition of what an essential nutrient is in your head. And with regard to proteins, some of the amino acids are considered essential. That is, our body cannot make them, or cannot make them in sufficient quantities to meet our needs. Therefore, we need to get it from outside our body through our diet. So what happens to protein production in your body if you're missing one or more, or you're low in one or more of the essential amino acids? What's going to happen to the production of that protein? So digestion of proteins, where does that begin? Where does it end? What is the smallest possible particle that a protein can get broken down to during digestion? That's an amino acid. So once amino acids are digested, and after they're absorbed directly into the bloodstream, because they are water soluble, they get transported to the tissues and the cells of our body. And in the cells of our body, they contribute to the amino acid pool. So the very first fate of those amino acids when they get to the cells of our body is that they are used as building blocks to replace cell parts, to replace cells. And then after that, it depends on your energy status. If you need energy, they can get burned as a source of energy. If you don't need energy, they can get stored as a source, as triglycerides, and stored as fat. And if you are low in glucose, those amino acids can actually get chemically altered, their nitrogen groups stripped off or deaminated, and the remaining carbon, what we call a carbon skeleton, can actually be used as a source of glucose via this action called this metabolic pathway called gluconeogenesis, to be used as a source of glucose, carbohydrate, for your body when you have low amounts of carbohydrate in your diet. So deamination is when you remove the nitrogen group from an amino acid, and transamination is when you transfer that nitrogen group to a different molecule called a carbon skeleton with a different arrangement to create one of these non-essential amino acids. Okay? Major functions of protein in the body. Where do I begin? Again, because it has calories, it's a source of energy. It's also important for structures. It's a component of your muscles. All enzymes are proteins. You have proteins transport things around your body. They're important for your immune function because they're the component of these antibodies. They help regulate the pH, or the acidity and basicity of your fluids in your body. They help maintain water balance so you don't get too swollen, or your cells don't get too shrink or get swollen. They have a number of different functions, so please review those. Define protein quality and give examples of foods containing high-quality proteins versus low-quality proteins. Remember, high-quality proteins are foods that contain all 9 of the essential amino acids. Low-quality proteins are foods that are missing or low in 1 or more of the essential amino acids. So what foods tend to be considered higher quality proteins or have that full complement of all 9 essential amino acids versus which foods do not? And therefore we have the basis of vegetarian and vegan diets, in which the adopters of these diets will reduce or completely eliminate the consumption of all animal-based foods, which tend to be higher in which are higher in the quality of their protein, or they contain all 9 essential amino acids. So how can someone who does not consume any animal-based proteins make sure that they get all 9 of the essential amino acids? Well, they can eat a lot of each individual plant-based food that they're consuming, but if they combine certain plant-based foods that may be missing one essential amino acid with a complementary food that's missing a different amino acid, they can have a meal that is made up of all 9 essential amino acids. So think about, what would that meal look like? So summarize the health advantages and nutritional risks of a vegan diet. We'll talk more about that when we talk about some of the micronutrients after the midterm. So don't focus too much on that there. So the 2 major forms of protein malnutrition. So this is, what happens if you don't get enough protein in your diet. In extreme cases, you could get either kwashiorkor or marasmus. These are forms of protein energy malnutrition. So just recognize what those might look like, and discuss reasons why consuming too much protein is not recommended. Too much of anything is not good for you. It can contribute to overweight and obesity. For too much protein, it could unnecessarily stress your kidneys, because your kidneys have to take that removed nitrogen group when the amino acids get metabolized, and they have to help remove that nitrogen from your body in the form of urea. So overtaxing your kidneys could also, too much protein in the body has also been associated with higher amounts of calcium leaving in your urine, and your calcium comes from your bones, so it may have an effect on bone health. But mostly too much protein, especially from animal sources, may increase your consumption of saturated fats, and that in turn can increase the LDL particles in your body, and that may in turn increase your risk for heart disease. So that's proteins. Now, energy metabolism. Let's take a deep breath here, okay? So these are the only things I need you to know about energy metabolism. What are anabolic versus catabolic reactions? So one of these is a reaction in which you start with smaller things and you build larger molecules, and the other is the opposite. You start with larger molecules and you break them down into smaller ones. Okay, and in doing so, when you're breaking them down, remember you're releasing the energy that's contained in the bonds between the atoms in those molecules, and you want to transfer that energy to a different molecule that can contain it for when it's needed in the body, and that's ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and it is used for the work that your body has to do. So it's used to help fuel all of your muscular actions, whether they be smaller or large muscles, or your heart is pumping, so that requires ATP. Moving a tiny finger, any of your muscles, so it's required for that. It's required, you need some energy in the form of ATP to build new molecules in your body, build new proteins and other molecules in your body. And you also need ATP to transport things across membranes and around your body, like in active transport, during absorption, among other transport functions. So ATP is produced when you completely metabolize any of your macronutrients. Again, you break down those macronutrient molecules and you capture the energy released in the bonds between those molecules, or the atoms in those molecules, and transfer it to ATP. So during the complete metabolism, or the breaking down of these macronutrients, once they get inside the cells of your body, after they're digested, absorbed, transported to the individual cells of your body, this is what happens in those individual cells. Your cells take the amino acids, the monosaccharides, and the fatty acids, and the glycerol. They break them down even further. They metabolize them. What's the definition of metabolism? And they produce ATP. In addition, they also produce some carbon dioxide and some water. So these are the three final products of energy metabolism: ATP, water, carbon dioxide. So identify the three major metabolic pathways through which the macronutrients are converted into energy. That's glycolysis, the TCA cycle, also called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. And the third metabolic pathway is the electron transport chain, which is also called oxidative phosphorylation. That's it. I just need you to know the names of them. So where does energy metabolism occur in the cell? Where in the cell do these reactions occur? Inside the cell, mostly in the mitochondria. All right. So examine the general differences in the breakdown of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins to usable energy components. I gave you a nice diagram that shows you how each of these, the glucose, the glycerol, and the fatty acids, and the amino acids, kind of enter these three pathways. So kind of just have that in your head. So define ketosis and describe conditions in which it occurs. We briefly talked about it under carbohydrates. Ketosis happens when you have a lack of carbohydrate either in your diet or in your body, because you don't have any stores of carbohydrate in your glycogen, and your body wants to instead start to release the glucose, a source of glucose, from your proteins, and you want to kind of slow that down, spare your protein from being broken down too rapidly. So with the lack of carbohydrate from those sources, your fatty acids cannot get completely metabolized. They can't go through the TCA cycle and produce ATP. So instead, they combine together and form these ketone bodies. So it can happen with a lack of carbohydrate in the diet. It can happen more severely if one has diabetes, either type 1 or type 2, in which they don't produce enough insulin, or the insulin that they do produce, their cells are resistant to it, which basically means the cells don't get any glucose in them, so the cells don't have any glucose to break down the fatty acids, so you produce more ketones. And high amounts of ketones can cause an acidic condition in the blood, and this is more common with people who have a diabetes, who do not have their condition under control, and with a really high amount of ketones in the body, ketone bodies in the body, it could acidify the blood. They could go into a diabetic coma, and eventually die. So describe the consequences of consuming an excessive amount of any macronutrient in excess of your body's energy or calorie needs. Too much of anything, too much carbohydrate, too much protein, too much fat will get converted to triglycerides and stored as fat in your body's tissues. And explain in general terms what happens to the metabolic pathways during feasting. We just talked about that. Everything gets converted to acetyl-CoA, and then they combine together into fatty acids, and glycerol combines, and you form more triglycerides. During fasting, a short period of fast, say like a day, your body is drawing upon its stored sources of glucose, your glycogen. It will start to break down your protein as tissues as a source of glucose. And if that goes on for long enough, once your glycogen stores are depleted of glucose and your body really doesn't want to give up its protein as a source of glucose, then you'll start to rely more and more on these ketone bodies as an alternate source of fuel for your cells, some of the cells of your body, in order to keep you alive for a longer period of time. Okay, that's energy metabolism. Next is energy balance. So what is energy balance? Balance means something in, something out. What is the energy in and what is energy out? Energy in comes from the calories that we consume from carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and if you do consume alcohol, there are calories in alcohol. How much? How many calories are in alcohol compared to the other, the macronutrients? So that's energy in. So what about energy out? How does our body deal with or burn those calories or expend those calories? So that's the relative contribution of the three major components of energy expenditure. So energy out is due to basal metabolism. Have a definition of that in your head. It's also due to physical activity. We can burn calories through physical activity above and beyond the calories burned through our basal metabolism. Remember, physical activity is the most variable of the three. And then we also expend or burn calories through the digestive process called the thermic effect of food. So I already talked about which one's the most variable. Relative contributions of each. You should know that. We also have different things or different factors that can affect our basal metabolic rate, the rate at which our basal metabolism burns calories. So what are some of those factors? We talked about age, we talked about gender. Why might there be a difference, between sexes with regard to how much male versus a female of the same body weight might burn calories or have a difference in their BMR. We talked about other factors that can affect BMR, so take a look at those. Getting back to how many calories we need, we talked about calories in and calories out. How many calories do we need in order to maintain our energy balance, keep in neutral energy balance and not gain or lose weight? Well, the amount of calories that you need to maintain your current weight is dependent on, it can be determined through your EER, your estimated energy requirements, and the variables that go into that calculation include your age, your sex, your height, your weight, and your physical activity level. Those things will determine how many calories you need. So define body composition. That is, we don't just look at weight to determine if someone is at a healthy weight. We look at their BMI, which is their body mass index. So that's their height, their weight over their height squared. So that's the standard that we use to determine whether someone is underweight, healthy weight, overweight, and obese. But we don't look at that alone. We also look at body composition. How much fat to lean mass do they have? If you're over fat, that's less healthy. If you're more lean, a higher proportion of lean body weight. And then, of course, where is that fat distributed? Is it above your waist or below your waist? Is it upper body fat versus lower body fat, the so-called apple versus pear? And what are the health risks of having your body weight distributed more around your middle or your abdomen than below your waist or below your abdomen, around your hip? And then how do we assess body fat? How do we assess body composition? There were a number of different techniques that we covered. So, have a working definition of each of those in mind. Also, with regard to eating disorders, there were 3 major types of eating disorders: anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and then we also talked about the female athlete triad, which involves eating disorders and eating disorder. So just have a working definition of each of those in your head. And last but not least is weight management. We know that 2/3 of Americans, over 66% and climbing right now, are either overweight or obese. That is, about a third is overweight, about a third is obese. So together, they constitute about 2/3 of the population here in the U.S. and other developed countries. So fat cells develop because, remember, the more you overeat, the more or eaten in excess of your body's energy needs, the more likely those macronutrients are going to get converted to triglycerides and stored as fat in your body's cells, and those fat cells can just hold an infinite amount of fat because they get bigger, they divide, so you have a higher number of fat cells. And with a higher number of fat cells, you have more of this lipoprotein lipase, or LPL enzyme, on each of those adipocytes, or fat cells. And their sole purpose in life is just to grab onto any triglycerides or fats that are floating or circulated nearby them, and that promotes fat storage as well. So with weight management, we know, and preventing obesity, we know that there's so many different causes of obesity, so many different factors: genetic factors, environmental factors, and those eating behaviors like absence of these or dysregulation with these so-called go and stop signals, the hunger and appetite, which are the go signals that trigger us to eat, to consume more food, and dysregulation in these stop signals, the satiety and satiation, which tell our body to naturally stop eating. So some problem with those can contribute to the development of overweight and obesity. So which foods are higher in satiety? Which foods might keep us fuller for a longer period of time after a meal? Think about that. Have some examples of those in your head. So health risks associated with fad diets, weight loss products, prescription drugs, surgical interventions with obesity. Losing weight is going to help certain people, those who need to lose weight, particularly if they have obesity-related conditions. But it's not for everyone, and there are some risks depending on the methods that you use. So what are some of the potential problems with each of these? And then, of course, first and foremost, what is the best way to prevent weight gain or maintain a weight loss or to lose weight? It involves 3 factors: the diet, adhering to the diet planning principles, engaging in regular physical activity, and changing whatever behaviors that may have led to overeating in the first place. And then, of course, the characteristics of a sound weight eating plan for weight management, diet planning principles: eating less than you take in, but making sure those calories count, that they are going to provide you with an adequate, balanced, calorie-controlled, nutrient-dense foods consumed in moderation in a wide variety. And that's it. That is your review session. Good luck, everyone. Be in touch with any questions if you have any between now and the time of the exam.